Hey everyone, welcome back to the NPTE podcast. This is Will Crane, your host. Thank you so much for joining me as we go through the content you need to know in order to dominate on test day. So today is a very special day. It's our 100th episode. But before I get to that, just a quick reminder, be sure to check us out over at ptfinalexam.com, where you can find out all about the courses that we're running. Be sure to join into our crash courses, our premium courses, or even our VIP class if you need the content that will get you across the finish line. And so it's something that we are very passionate about. And frankly, it's something we've been doing for over a decade now. And we have a lot of fun getting people across the finish line for the NPTE. So today is our 100th episode, and just as a quick, I was trying to think what I could do for 100 as far as our little celebration here, so to speak. So figured maybe we could do 100 practice questions all together in this one episode, or maybe we could do 100 things I've learned while doing this podcast, or we could take 100 student questions. And instead, I just decided to give you 100 practice questions, but really it ends up being more than 100 practice questions. Really, it's actually over 150 practice questions. These are the questions that you've seen here on the podcast. You can find all of this for download for free over at ptfinalexam.com/podcast, where you'll be able to download all of those questions for free. So let's say you've already subscribed over at ptfinalexam.com/podcast. Just go over and do it again, and you'll get, in addition to the material you've already received, you'll get this new material. Again, the way to access that is go to ptfinalexam.com/podcast to access, like I said, it ends up being over 150 practice questions. I know I'm rounding up. I should have maybe just only put 100 in that document, but I decided, what the heck? I think you'd enjoy having more questions rather than fewer questions. So I just threw it all together for you. And a lot of those are the compiled questions that we've heard in these podcast episodes. But I've also got questions that are not included in the podcast episodes. So again, you'll want to check that out. So as far as things I want to talk about today, I just want to talk about some of the things I have learned and some of the inspiring stories that I have received over the 10 years that I've been doing this. And so I started PT Final Exam back in 2012, and so now we're into our 11th year of PT Final Exam. And it's something that really started from, and I've mentioned this back in episode 1 and a little bit about how and why I started PT Final Exam, but it was something that was, rooted in my own, I don't want to say ignorance necessarily, but rooted in my own ignorance as I was preparing for test day. I wished that I'd had someone to walk me through what it is that I needed to know. I wished I had someone who could just walk me through, all right, this is what's on the test. This is how you prepare for the test. This is the scope and style of questions that you'll experience. And granted, I did have a review book. I enjoyed that. I took some practice questions. I enjoyed those. But I still went into test day feeling quite nervous about what it was that I was really going to face on test day. And so I guess the moral of the story is that back in 2012, I started writing about my experience, back when blogging was really cool. Started writing about my experience, and I got some people interested in signing up for a class, and that started a class. And it just has blossomed into, tens of thousands of students that have participated in PT Final Exam. In fact, some of the other folks who are out there doing NPT prep, they were members of my class. And so, really, you've come to the source here. This is where we help people get across the finish line. And so just as maybe an inspiring moment, just a little moment of inspiration, as you're coming into test day, recognize that this is difficult. This is a really difficult process. And I've decided that studying is a bit of an art and a science. So clearly there are some evidence-based ways to study. And we've talked about those in these episodes. Evidence-based practice includes having multiple forms of repetition. So not just seeing the content, but repeating it. And I like to call this active repetition, where you are trying to create, you're putting it in your own words, bullet points. This is where flashcards are so handy because it forces you to consider what the content is and then formulate it in your own words. Other things that are evidence-based strategies for studying include practice questions. So taking loads and loads and loads of practice questions. That's why our exam simulator is so handy. And really that's why, the PET exams and any other practice exam can be so helpful because it trains you to see what they're looking for on test day. Now, there is an art to studying, though. So this is something that's a little bit less quantifiable, but the art of studying involves finding your, forgive the inaccurate term, but to find your groove. So by finding your groove, what I mean by that is that you're trying to find the process or the steps that are required to get you into your study mindset. So when I was in technical writing in college, I remember our instructor was our professor, she was telling us about what your writing process entails. And, from the silliest base point of origin, she'd say, well, when you start your writing process, you have to open up your laptop. When you start your writing process, you have to be sitting at a desk. And when you start your writing process, you have to have completed all the other tasks that you need to get done for the moment so that you can focus in on your writing. And so that follows here. I feel like it's an excellent example of how you, as you approach your studies, you need to have in mind what it is you need to get done and the process in order to get into your study mindset. So for instance, as an example here, you would want to study in an area that is a well-lit environment, usually some type of desk or some place where you're sitting up and engaged with the content. There's a lot to be said about posture when it comes to studying and actually learning content. Usually an engaged, more power posture is better than a relaxed, sleepy posture. So that's number one is finding a good position or a good setting for your studies. But then the other part that's a little bit of an art is your self-analysis. And you'll do this a lot on test day, but the self-analysis of knowing, all right, am I 100% focused on this content? Yes or no? If I'm not 100% focused, what can I do to become 100% focused? So again, it's this balance of analyzing yourself and putting yourself in the best mindset possible so that you can dominate either the studies or the test, whatever it is that you're doing at the moment. So we've got the science, which is involved in the evidence-based learning strategies, the things that you need to know. And then you take the other side and you take the art of studying, which is to put yourself in the right mindset, obviously the right frame of mind, the right position, the right tasks completed before you start. That's an example of how studying is both an art and a science. Another thing that I've learned while doing this podcast and really while training PTs over the last decade is that I found that good PTs and good PTAs are curious. They're interested and curious in the content, meaning they want to not just know what's going on, but they want to know why it's going on. They want to know the underlying causative factors that lead from A to B to C. And I find that those are the people that do the best on test day, the ones that are really interested in why something is the way it is. Like why, for instance, a total hip arthroplasty posterior approach requires caution with hip flexion. So rather than just memorize that you avoid hip flexion past 90 degrees, understand that as you flex the hip past 90 degrees with a posterior approach, the tissue is weaker on the back side, on the posterior side. And so it's almost like a lever arm. As you bring the hip forward, you're levering or prying the femoral head out of its socket. And because the tissue is weak on the posterior side, you have the hip precautions. So that's just another example of why, or understanding the why behind what we do. And that really translates nicely into exam performance, because then it makes it less about memorizing a specific cookbook and more about understanding the underlying principle. So that's what another thing I've discovered is good PTs and PTAs are curious and they want to know what's going on, and not just what, but why it's happening. And then maybe the last thing just to mention here as we close out this podcast is just that the NPTE does not define you. It's what refines you. And that's something I wrote really about 8 years ago. I had an open letter to those who failed the NPTE. And the idea here is that the NPTE is a test. Obviously it's an academic performance test. It's something where you have to spit out what you know in a time frame, in a test center. You've got everything that really lines up to make this kind of a painful process. But remember, you are more than just what this test says about you. So what I mean by that is that as you are struggling and learning and growing and becoming the best PT you can, let's say that you do have a failed attempt on the NPTE. It's certainly something that's happened to lots and lots of people, but at the same time, it's not the end. It's not the definition of you. Rather, it's just an opportunity to refine your skill set before taking it again. So I've come up with, not that I've come up with them, but a few of the examples that I just wanted to share. And I've talked about some of these before in the podcast, but oh my goodness, I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have just such inspiring stories. Just to share a few, During COVID, I had a student. She was a student of PT final exam, and through the whole process, I mean, it was just a heartbreaking story of how she was going to PT school out of state. She comes home one weekend and she finds all of her locks changed. Her husband had kicked her out. I mean, really just kind of a crummy story. But what ended up happening was that her husband, ex-husband now, and kids had been totally removed from her. She had been placed, I don't know if a restraining order was placed on her, but something where she couldn't really see her kids or have custody of her kids until she got a full-time job as a PT. And so the trouble was, though, that it was during the COVID days, and so all the courts were shut down. She couldn't litigate it. Really, everything depended on her passing the NPTE, and that's where she came into our sphere of influence, where we were able to help her and get her across the NPTE. And really, it was such an inspiring comeback story for her to be able to pull her life back together based on getting that NPTE passed. Another example that comes to mind is that I had, and you can see this lady's video on ptfinalexam.com/reviews. You can find her 75 years old. She had been out of the profession for more than 3 decades, and she was trying to get back into her career as a PT as a 75-year-old. It took her 6 months, took her a lot of effort and planning, but she was able to pass the NPTE. Another example I had, this was just last year, I had a woman who was she was a military spouse, transferred all across the country, all across the world. She needed to pass the NPTE in order to begin her practice. And her life was disarray is the wrong description, but just there was a lot going on between deployments and moves. There was just a lot going on. She needed to pass this exam so she could get to work, and she was able to pass on her 6th attempt. Another student, this was pre-2016, so this was back before they imposed the 6-time lifetime limit. This student had taken the NPTE 10 times, and no joke, she had scored between 590 and 598 10 times in a row. And there was no one more frustrated than her. It was just one of those things like, you're kidding me. How can you be so close so many times in a row? And she took our class and was able to pass on her 11th attempt. And really, she chalks it up to just seeing the test differently, being able to see it with different eyes, so that she not only understood what was being tested, but why the things, again, back to what we said earlier, to create that curiosity of not just what to know, but why we need to know it. And then finally, the last one, just a last little story here, sharing about, I had a PT. He was a dad, had 4 kids, wife, sweet little family, and he was stuck behind the test. He could not pass the exam. Everything depended on him passing to begin to be cash positive, to get a job, to be able to support his wife and kids. Like, he was desperate to pass the exam and had failed 4 times in a row. I mean, it was just, I remember talking to him that he said his wife was just looking at him. She loved him and wanted him to succeed, but she was worried about their family and their kids. Just, there was a lot of worry going on in that household. And so we worked with him, got him through the test. He was able to pass on his 5th attempt, is now working as a fabulous PT, and just a really amazing comeback story of coming from the brink of, oh my goodness, I've got to rethink my whole life career strategy, into actually practicing in the career of his choice. And so I guess just the reason I mention all these again is to point out that the NPT is not what defines you. It's what refines you. It gets you from where you are now to hopefully level up your skills as a PT. So remember, as you're studying and as you're going through this very painful process, preparing to become a physical therapist, an actual licensed physical therapist, just remember that the exam, while being painful, is worth doing. And I guess it's something that I've heard said many, many times, but anything worth doing in life typically comes at a cost. Usually cost of your time, your effort, your energy, whatever it is. This is an example of that. It is worth doing. It's worth getting through, but it comes at a cost. And that cost is usually in time spent studying, in a lot of emotional energy, going through practice questions and finding out what you don't know so that you know what you don't know, so that then you can work on knowing it. There's a lot that goes into this. And so I guess I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the efforts that you put into this. And thank you for what you do to add to the profession of PT. I know that that as you encounter your first patients in, well, I don't want to say the real world. You've been practicing as a student PT for quite a bit. But as you enter the other side as a licensed independent clinician, you'll find that it is so satisfying. It is so worth doing. And I just want to say thank you for what you do getting through this whole process. So as we celebrate this 100th episode, just a reminder, head over to ptfinalexam.com/podcast where you can download all the free questions I have posted. Like I said, I've got over 150 posted there for you. If you have already subscribed and you want access to those, just go back and subscribe again, or put your email, just put it in the form again, and you'll get it, and it'll be a link where you'll be able to download those questions, no problem. So again, that's ptfinalexam.com/podcast, and you can find out all of the information you need over at ptfinalexam.com. So as we bring today to a conclusion, just a reminder, leave us a 5-star review over on Google Play or iTunes, Spotify, wherever it is you listen to this podcast. I'll catch you in the next episode as we go through a bunch more practice questions. But in the meantime, keep a smile on your face, grin on your chin as you go through all this, and Will Crane fist bumps all around. I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks.